We got him. Those are the words of investigators now that they've rounded up Tyler Robinson, 22-year-old, allegedly the prime suspect in the assassination of Charlie Kirk, 22 years old, with a 4.0 GPA, radicalized to carry out this hit on Charlie Kirk. Apparently, he wrote manifestos and letters talking about that Charlie Kirk was full of hate. He wrote anti-fascist messages on shell casings and apparently turned in by family and friends. We have so many questions as we unpack his connections to a Discord server. Who else was he working with? Did anyone help him hide this planning in the lead up to this? Who was he radicalized from? His father, apparently law enforcement. So many things to talk about. We wanted to bring the former FBI whistleblower Kyle Seraphin into the show today to talk all about this. He's been really level-headed and sober through this entire process because he knows what it's like to lead investigations like this. Kyle, welcome back to the show. Great to see you.
Thanks for having me back on. Good to talk to you.
So I think I want to start with the FBI part of this before we dive into who Tyler was and the circumstances about how he pulled off this shooting, but specifically on the FBI's response to this. You have been pretty critical about their initial response, Kash Patel coming out when they rounded up some old guy, initially saying, we got him, and then having to walk that back about an hour later and say, no, we didn't get him. We released him. Then having to rely on the community to find this individual. There seems to be a lot of, and then Kash Patel like walking the scene at one point, like he's there, like, and as you described it online, like this is all theater. Like, why does the FBI director need to be at Utah Valley University? Like, it seemed like it was all theater. So anyway, you're just a high level, sort of 30,000 foot level assessment of the FBI's response to all of this.
Well, all of it was illogical and everything seemed like it was deemed towards or geared towards getting attention and maybe a positive PR win. And this is my analysis of it from looking on the outside. We also had a couple other things that happened during this week that were understated and maybe got overshadowed by the death of Charlie Kirk. One of which was a lawsuit that dropped. It's 68 pages that explain some of the insanity that's been going on at the FBI since Trump has taken over. And it's been my conjecture that if you don't handle weaponized law enforcement, you're probably going to be screwed about taking over any other piece of government. DOD is great. HHS is great. Getting DOJ under control. All those things are super important. But if you don't have the people that can actually go out there with a badge and a gun and kill you on the right track, then I think you're in bad shape. And it seems like they touched poorly right up front, did a bad job right up front. And this lawsuit that got dropped out by 3 former agents is really, really damning. Then we got in the middle of this actual investigation, we were hearing that because of that screw up and because of that misstep and frankly, a completely unforced error by Kash Patel, where he goes out and makes an announcement that he had to retract an hour later. He was apparently screaming at his subordinates about how it was going to make him look bad. And everything that I see shows a man who is on the edge of not holding his job. I think Donald Trump's favor has left Kash Patel. I think it's been obvious to me for quite a while now, and that he's been kind of on the outs because his performance is suboptimal. And I'm going to give people an example where they can listen with their own words. They can listen to the press conference that happened. They can also listen to the Fox and Friends. If you go listen to Fox and Friends and Donald Trump was on early this morning, the first thing he went and did was really straightforward. He said, we've got him. We have the guy we think it is. High probability that it's the right person. That actually ended up happening on September 11th at 10 p.m. And then they booked him into the jail cell somewhere around 2 a.m. on September the 12th. Donald Trump goes out and announces it. He says, Pam Bondi did a really great job. Now, I don't know what the AG's role is in an investigation or a manhunt. I actually have no idea what it would be, having been someone who's been on a couple of manhunts. I don't know what they do, but maybe she did a great job. But he was very complimentary of her. He was complimentary of an unnamed person for the United States Marshal Service, and he was complimentary of the local police in Utah. What I heard conspicuously absent was praise for the FBI or praise for FBI Director Kash Patel or even Dan Bongino. And so that was pretty, very specific. Then when you hear Kash go out there in the middle of the press conference, what I heard him do is immediately start his fawning sort of Donald Trump is the reason why we were able to do this, like his resources and his support and the fact that his backing of the FBI has been integral to us doing that. At the end of the day, Clayton, we just saw one of the most textbook things that ever happens in any crime. Like, forget about a high priority or a high visibility national level crime. If somebody goes out and takes someone else's life in America, the first thing the law enforcement's going to do is they're going to scour surveillance footage and say, can we see who did this? Then they're going to trace the steps back as best it makes sense. They're going to be looking for a murder weapon. They're going to be looking for a getaway car if the person's not caught on the scene. And then they're going to try to identify who that person is from surveillance footage or local witnesses. That's exactly what happened. What we heard was, and if you read the probable cause statement that was released by Louder with Crowder, they got a pretty good insight during the booking. This guy, they laid out. They say, here's the events that took place. There was a shooting. It happened at 12:23 on September the 10th. And then they say that we followed back to the guy's ingress to the property, and it looks like he was walking with a stiff right leg. To us, that indicates that he might, they don't say it explicitly in the probable cause statement, but they seem to indicate that he had the rifle down his pants and hiding in one of the legs. And then they also mention that after he goes up on the roof, that is no longer obvious. He doesn't have that limp anymore. And so they kind of let us read between the lines. So what you're trying to do is, how did the person get there? What sort of weapon system did they use? How did they leave the space if they weren't captioned immediately? And they did all those things. And they actually explain all of that in a very straightforward and logical probable cause statement. It doesn't mention anything about additional conspirators. And there may be people that were either online in a Discord chat, or maybe they were part of his text message group. And there is some indication from what you hear there, it's possible that he had one or two accomplices that were involved, either helping him hide the weapon, helping him get away, helping him plan, or give him good ideas. But the straightest distance between 2 points for me, and particularly for most people in law enforcement, is going to be a straight line. And if you want to make deviations and you want to involve nation state actors, if you want to try to claim that there's a foreign intel connection, or if you want to say that there are people in the crowd that are somehow able to time something without obvious, communication devices and visual signals, you've got to start putting in a lot more into a conspiracy than one guy has a really bad idea. Maybe a couple of his friends agree with it and want to help him do it. And then he goes and executes it, and then he runs away. And then later on, the most obvious thing happens. His dad turned him in. There's no FBI injection in there at all. This is not a federal crime, at least not on the onset. It looks like a homicide, a high profile one, a truly tragic one, a young man snuffed out at his peak of his capabilities on the public sphere. But none of that indicates initially that the FBI has any involvement whatsoever. And they don't necessarily need to inject themselves unless they desperately want that win. And that's what I think we saw. And I don't think that the administration at the highest end of the executive thought that was a great idea.
It really is Occam's razor at the end of the day. There were so many people jumping to conclusions about it. Well, you mentioned Louder with Crowder. Of course, we interviewed the CEO, Gerald, the other day here on the show after they received that ATF message, that email message saying that there was trans, inscriptions and things like that written on, whether it was the gun barrel, some of the shell casings and things like that. Yep. I don't think that that's been confirmed now at all, and it doesn't seem.
Yeah, it's actually in the probable cause statement. They mentioned that there were 4 shells that were involved. One was at a spent casing, and the other 3 bullets that were still live. And they said essentially one of them was sort of a gamer meme type thing. It was like a cat whiskers that is done with a letter and then an O and then another letter, and it said something about his bulge. And that's not real obvious to me, but apparently it's gamer stuff. There was another one that said "Hey Fascist Kesh," so that seemed to be sort of an anti-fascist type thing. There was a Bello Ciao, which is an Italian song that the anti-fascists apparently sing. So this is another anti-fascist bit. And then there was something to the effect of, if you can read this, you're gay, or if you read this, you're gay, is what it actually said. So that's kind of an internet meme. It's the joke that if the FBI goes into my closet and they pull out all my stuff and they get to the bottom of it, they find a piece of paper that says, if you're reading my stuff, you're gay. And so literally, like, there's jokes about this online. So this guy obviously had a pretty aggressive online presence. It sounds like he was on some Discord channels. They were having some chats back and forth, and he's doing memery. There was another one that was like a computer code, which they said was for a video game that I'm not familiar with. But those were all confirmed. Whether that means that it was transgender ideology, I can't say that. And from the people that I talked to in the analytical world, it doesn't seem like they were necessarily transgender specific. It does seem it was leaning more towards the Antifa and the anti-fascist type ideology. But that's an ideology. So there you got that. But at the end of the day, straight line. And in fact, when you go watch the video that was quote unquote released by the FBI, but it's a university security camera, what we saw was a guy crossing from left to right on the top of a building. He comes running into the foreground of the building, which is still ways away. So we've got kind of grainy footage at best, but it appears like he's moving a longer type object of some kind. Now, the rifle that they talk about is a Mauser 98. So it's a bolt action rifle in 30-06. It's got a scope on it. They showed a picture of it. And all these people had these questions about it. So like, if you watch that video, you can tell he's manipulating some sort of object. It looks like he swings it a little bit in the air. He puts it down. He lowers his body, and then he drops to the ground. And it looks like, and this is just my estimation from looking at the surveillance footage a lot of times and a lot of time analyzing that and a bunch of time behind a weapon, it looks like he actually takes the rifle as he's landing, and it hits the ground on the buttstock in the earth where his foot plants. Now he takes it, the landing pretty hard. When you're in the military, they teach you how to do a thing called a parachute landing fall, where you kind of like tuck and roll. He landed and just kind of flexed it with his knees. Not advisable for a long period of time. The fact that he walked off was probably all adrenaline. But it does look like he landed squarely with maybe 2 points of contact being the feet. And they said that they got a big footprint there. But additionally, it looks like the rifle actually struck the ground pretty aggressively there too. If that's the case, the picture that everyone has seen that came from supposedly out in the woods where the rifle was supposedly ditched, it shows you something that I think I shared with you privately. It looks like the scope is recessed way further back than would be normal for anybody who's a serious shooter. And so,
right. So can you explain that? So like laying prone, you wouldn't put the scope that way. So a lot of people saying, well,
right.
why is the scope on at this weird angle?
Yeah. So the rifle is not a particularly expensive rifle. A Mauser 98, you can pick them up for $500 to $700 online right now. And I went and did a check real quick. You can find they're surplus, they're sporterized, they're imported, and so on. It may not be the most common caliber, but it's not super expensive to get these things. The scope itself looks like it might be maxing out at about a 12 power. So it's not a super high powered scope, but it's appropriate for the 200 to 400 yard shot. No problem. Most 30-06 is zeroed. If you look at the dope on the box, what they call the dope chart or the ballistics chart, it actually gives you the 0 point as being 200 yards. So this is a 200-yard cartridge. It's an 800-yard cartridge if you really want to stretch it out. You know, it's not hard to make a 200-yard shot with what is a normal deer rifle or deer cartridge. People use it for elk as well. So long and short of it is, it looks like when he hit, the way that scope would normally be, there's a certain amount of distance between the back lens and your eye, which is referred to as eye relief. That looks like it's all eaten up. And if you look at the picture, and people can find it online very easily, it looks like the turret, which is where you adjust the windage and the elevation and where you would focus the scope, is actually backed all the way up and smack dab against the rear scope ring. Again, if you were to have that thing slide back as far as it could go, that's where it would stop. So it doesn't look like you would shoot the rifle in that condition. It looks like he probably changed the location of the scope by banging it against the ground because it probably wasn't tightened down enough to handle that. And then the second piece of it is you'll see that the front ring is in direct contact with what we call the bell, which is the front objective lens. It flares outward. And so the scope has a tube that is a certain thickness, and then it gets much, much thicker, and your scope ring is not going to be able to go over it. And so it's maxed out there as well. So it looks like somebody hit the scope hard enough from the front, or the rear of the rifle hit it and the scope rode back, and then it locked into the position that is as far as back it can go without breaking off the scope rings. All of that's consistent with what I would expect from someone jumping off a roof. And then the last little piece is people said, well, it was in a box. Why is it in a box in the woods? And so I'll just give you some basic evidence collection technique. Generally speaking, anytime you collect evidence, you want as many as 4 photographs, maybe even more. The first one is called an establishing shot. It shows the scene. So you're going to want to get the room that it's in. You're going to want to get a walking path and some sort of orientation for the viewer to see, we're in the woods. Here's the path. Here's the big tree, blah, 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 whatever it might be. And so you orient the shot. The second one will be a little bit closer, which gives you sort of a little bit more understanding of what was going on, if it's in a bush, a tree, if it's underground or whatever. And then your last one will be known as a detail shot, which will just be the weapon or the whatever the piece of evidence is. And then generally speaking, if you're going to collect something like a rifle and it's against a backdrop like grass or bushes or things that are not great, you're going to put it in an evidence box, which is exactly what the picture that was released looked like to me. It's a box. It fits a rifle. It usually has holes in the back for zip ties to be able to isolate it. Then they put some tape on there so nobody can tamper with it. And then you have chain of custody. And then you send that sucker off to be processed to either a ballistic lab or DNA or whatever. So all of that is very consistent with what I would expect anybody who's collecting evidence, particularly a long rifle. If you know that you're looking for a weapon system, you bring a pistol box and you bring a rifle box and maybe a couple of them. These are in all the what they call ERT or evidence response team kits, certainly for the FBI, but I'm sure local law enforcement does too.
So why in this situation do you think he would have gone to great lengths to take the rifle with him off of the roof, bring it down as if he's going to bring it back home with him, and then just abandon it in the woods? I mean, I'm asking you to get inside of his mindset here.
Well, this was actually addressed during the press conference after all these things were let out. So the governor went actually and read through the investigative process, and that included some interviews of this guy's roommate, Tyler's roommate. Apparently had some text messages back and forth between Tyler and possibly a third party and the roommate. It's hard to say exactly from the way that they explained it, but it does sound like that he stashed the weapon with the expectation that either a third party was going to recover it on his behalf as he was kind of hot on the trail of escaping, or he was going to return to it to get a stashed weapon. You can imagine that running around in the woods with a rifle, even if it's covered with a cloth, is not something you want to do for a very long time if you want to avoid scrutiny, particularly as more and more people were aware that happened, that the shooting had just happened, just a couple of minutes behind him on foot. So I imagine he wanted to get it out of his hands as soon as possible. And then they basically were making plans. So it was actually addressed. Like all of that stuff lines up. Nobody wants to accept the official narrative to a government that tends to lie to us on a regular basis. And I get the same instinct. At the same time, when the story they tell you is a straight line between what you would expect a normal person to do, they even talked about how he changed clothing, and you'd say, well, is that spycraft? I'm in the middle of watching a series right now on Amazon called Dark Wolf, which is the prequel to the Terminal List series that Chris Pratt did. And so they're talking about, it's actually really good too, if you guys want to watch some good entertainment.
Well, I love the Terminal List. I've read, just about every one of the books. So
you got 5 episodes of this season have been released so far. And one of the things they're doing is they're trying to either make or break surveillance. And when you're trying to break surveillance and have people not follow you, you can do certain tactics like changing your costume. And the usual things you do is you either don or doff a hat, taking it on or off. You swap a jacket, especially if you have a 2-sided jacket that's dark on the inside and light on the outside. So you'll change the color of your outer garment, and you might change the way that you walk. The one thing that people rarely do in hasty surveillance changes is they don't change their shoes. And that actually ends up being something that was identified on this kid because he had a shoe imprint in the ground, which was a Converse All-Star. And they actually found him with Converse All-Stars. And there's pictures of him all over the place that they had from family and social media with Converse All-Stars on. So switching out your shoes is usually the sort of the straw that a real serious surveillance person is going to look for. If I can see that you're wearing the same bright, shiny Nikes, and then you change your whole clothes and you change your gimp, but I see that those shoes, I can sometimes pick out that you've done a costume change, and that's for a trained eye only. Converse All-Stars are pretty ubiquitous. They're everywhere. So it's not like anybody would necessarily think that they needed to change them, but that may have been the one thing that kind of stitched through all of it. Anyway, the stuff he's doing, it's in Hollywood. So that means I know that it's common knowledge. It's public. You don't have to be a super spy. You don't have to be trained by some foreign intelligence service. Did I get trained that way? Yeah. As a counterintelligence agent, I did, but I'm seeing it on TV too. And you can see it on Born Identity, and you could see it on any of these CIA movies whenever they do this stuff. So it is, it's a common tactic to be able to switch up your look. And this kid did that. Apparently he went in looking one way, changed his look while he was doing the shooting, came back down. And then somewhere between the time he left the roof and the time that he got back home, he changed his appearance again, which is consistent with, premeditation for sure. Some kind of a plan, but whether it was just his plan or whether it was 2 guys' plans or 3 guys' plan, we'll find out a little bit later on. This is going to be kind of just regular law enforcement work, interviewing people, checking IP addresses, looking through these chats and so on.
Initially, everyone said this was a professional hit. The way he was struck in the chest. I think you and I were speaking privately that headshots, as you said to me, headshots are for the movies. If you really want to take someone out, you're shooting for the chest, aiming for the heart. And that seems to be exactly what happened. Hit that soft body armor that he was wearing. Perhaps then traveled, as you mentioned, up through the spine, out his neck, but went through that body armor. And it seems like it was aimed right at his heart. But do you still feel this was a professional hit? Or now that we have this kid 22 years old, do you change your opinion of that at all?
I immediately push back against the professional hit crowd. Everybody wants to say that. I think we've lost a lot of basic competencies when it comes to the average person knowing how to shoot, especially people who live in urban areas. They don't know that a 200-yard shot is standard and common. There's probably, a couple 100,000 12-year-old boys that are out there that have taken their first elk at that distance. I actually used to live next to some of them in New Mexico. It's really just not a difficult shot to do a 200-yard thing. And imagine this, not just 200 yards, but facing on with a static target while you're in the prone position. It's the best situation possible. If this kid was like on the run or on a knee or doing something else, you're talking about something totally different. I say kid, he's 22 years old. He's a young man.
Right.
But to be able to lay on an elevated position.
We even spoke to veterans here on the show about this, and this was like a part of, apparently once a year, you had to prove yourself at a simple 200-yard shot, like in the military. The old school salty Marines will tell you that they've shot iron sights out to 500 to qualify out of basic, and that's a common shot. I've got a magnified optic that goes up to 6 on one of my ARs, and AR platter rifles are less powered. They don't have the range that the 30-06 would have. But at 200 yards, I can group 5 rounds inside of an inch and a half. It's a very accurate rifle. So with a decent bolt action gun, and that's why you choose it, you get a lot more accuracy for your money out of a bolt action gun. With a decent bolt action, you're going to be able to reliably hit 200 yards with just about anything off the shelf that's in the $500 and up range. So this is a Walmart special option. This is some sort of an importer that's done a sporterization on an imported Mauser action. This is your standard, varmint type guns. It's really not that hard to get a 200-yard shot. And again,
facing you with a white background. We're talking about the best case scenario. You've got a guy who's like, he's wearing white, so he's wearing a light color to be able to put your dark crosshairs on in full light, sitting in a little bit of shade so you're not getting glare on it, and you're straight on from an elevated position. It's not a difficult shot. It's horrific to kind of talk the technicalities of somebody's life, being snuffed out like this, and for the reasons that we think were involved. Horrific. But as far as the difficulty of it, this sort of shot is made every single day in much less ideal conditions in the field to take deer and elk all over those western states, to include Utah. So you don't have to be a pro to pull this one off, not even a little bit. And even the people that are talking about the adrenaline jump of doing it, you have such a big window at that, a human body width. We're looking at least 12 inches across, and Charlie was 6'5", so he's a big guy with a big chest. He's got a lot of, north and south real estate there too. So even with a little bit of windage at 200 yards, you're not going to see a bullet move. And the north and south end of it, let's say they didn't get the elevation exactly right because of the fact that they're coming from a higher position. All of this is all really, really, really bad for you. And from the way we saw that exit wound and the way he went down, I mean, he obviously knew that what he hit. You can see it through the scope right after you pull a trigger like that. I think it was probably immediately fatal. I think we'll find out more about it as they do the autopsy and all that sort of the gory details come out, which is all sad to read. But at the end of the day, like, I think the kid needed one shot. That's all he did. And then he did his egress plan. He decided to evacuate the area, and he did so effectively. And he did this thing you would do. You go walk and disappear. The first thing they teach you when you're doing this kind of stuff in the military is you want to immediately find a way away from that initial contact, wherever people are going to see you. And then you want to blend in. And so what did he do? He's a college campus kid walking with a backpack, and then he goes off across the street. He's on foot. Nobody's the wiser. All those things line up very easily for me. I don't have to get much more involved. I don't have to talk about somebody in the crowd was distracting the cops, because by the time law enforcement was looking for him, they were already looking in a group of people, right? And this happened on a rooftop, and he went out the backside of it. So there were no cops that were going to be there. They didn't need a distraction for any of that stuff. I mean, none of those things were going to hold up the police response when they realized that a rifle shot, rang out from a building. They're not going to be looking in the crowd per se, even if they did grab that guy. We saw the elderly man grab first, and we saw a younger guy grab second. That doesn't stop the number of resources that are going to surge to that scene. It's, at the end of the day, it's just really horrifically sad.
Right. And it's pretty straightforward. I think so many people jumping to conclusions about, again, foreign people saying, oh, it's Qatar, or it's Israel, or,
all that.
There's some sort of, it's a group of trans activists. And by the way, we should point out that if your brain is so corrupted by trans ideology, or you're on some sort of medication, hormones, like to have that kind of focus and pre-planning is almost impossible for someone who is fixated on their own sexuality 24/7. I mean, the evidence and the science is actually in on that. It's very difficult for even these people who have this sort of gender dysphoria, and they're hopped up on medicine, to even hold down a job, let alone have this sort of pre-planning and all of this. And I'm not saying it's not possible. We've certainly seen these mass shootings, but this is much more precise and premeditated, and a lot of planning went into carrying this out, no?
Yeah, a lot might. I mean, that's a relative term. What's a lot of planning? Is this like the way a military does an operation? I doubt it. But at the end of the day, it was with forethought. You have a time, you have a place, you scouted out a location. The odds are he knew how to get up on there in advance. If he was like me, when I was in college, I was 18 and 19 years old. I didn't drink, so I spent a lot of time exploring buildings and finding out which roofs I could get on top of, because it was interesting to me, because I was a kid. And, that's what young men spend their time doing. And they're looking for either a place to go make out with a girl, or go see the stars, or whatever it is that you do. So I imagine that he had to scout out the location. He knew how to get there. He went straight, from where he parked, straight up there and got out, got up on the roof, took the weapon system either in a leg, or maybe he stashed it there in advance. We'll find out in the future whether or not that happened. And, however he got the weapon system up there. And then it was a simple matter of, within a few minutes, he was on target, took a shot, and then he, what we say in the military, beat feet. He went out there and made a crappy jump off a pretty illogical thing. Like, if I was going to look for somebody, I would not immediately think they probably jumped off this 15-story or 15-foot roof to the ground. That's not the route that you would think. You'd think that you'd catch them coming back down the stairs again. So, that's well thought out, and it's a little bit dangerous and risky. Took that risk, was successful in evading for 33 hours.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it was,
I guess all that to say,
successful move.
Yeah. I guess all that to say that I never believed the the conspiracy, was a trans activist and the whole thing and all of that. It just didn't make any sense to me. But anyway, that's where we are.
Yeah, just
we're
real
so
quickly
quick to judge.
The trans activist end of it and sort of the ideology, like people that were frantic about something, that ends up being a much more frenetic situation. I think it's much less planned. It's less organized. It's going to be a lot sloppier. And then the whole nation state actor thing, because as you said, Qatar, Israel, whatever else, everybody wanted to kind of jump in immediately. I saw some guy say it was an intelligence grade assassin. I don't even know what those words mean. That must sound cool to somebody that doesn't know anything about the intelligence community. But if they wanted to do that, they would have poisoned his cheeseburger and he would have just fallen over on the stage, or they would have staged a car accident. There's a million ways that you can make, and here's how we know that. The Russians are professionals. And when they want to take somebody out, someone comes and blows some powder in your face in a bus stop, and then you stop breathing. There's poisons. There's all kinds of quiet ways to do it. Do you know how many times we've seen somebody post up and take a long shot on anybody, like in the last, let's say 50 years? It's not something people do. Who's been shot like that? McKinley, maybe? I think Teddy Roosevelt was shot that way.
But even Teddy Roosevelt was shot like from like 5 feet away, right?
Right.
And
what you normally see is
in his speech, in his pocket speech, I think,
And you get the same sort of thing. This is what happened to Reagan as well. Like, it was an up close. Somebody breaks out of the crowd and takes a pistol shot from very close range into a protected detail, and that's why someone like Charlie Kirk would be wearing some low visibility body armor. It's soft armor because it's supposed to stop a pistol, because your threat is most likely someone who's in the crowd that decides to break out of it and pull a low powered weapon and try to shoot you from there. And they're not likely to hit your head. That's an accident. So they aim for center of mass. You want to put something that covers the center of mass. That's the logical thought. For someone to post up with a powerful rifle, and 30-06 is plenty powerful. Like I said, it'll take large, thin-skinned game from distance. And so if that's we just don't, that's not a threat that exists in America in a general rule. You don't have people sniping at you in public events. The president looks out for that, but that's just not and the Secret Service theoretically is supposed to look for it, but for our people that are given a debate to some.
Right. I mean, that's the thing, right? People are like, well, why wasn't there more security on the rooftops? So, well, he's not a president of the United States. He's, he's a 31-year-old guy who goes to college campuses,
Yeah. Charlie said that he had a lot of faith and that he wasn't going to let fear keep him from doing what he think God wanted him to do. And so if you're a man who believes that God's going to look out for you and that your job is to go out and proselytize, and he did, it makes perfect sense to me. Now, the sad thing is you probably could have avoided a lot of this with like a $100 drone or a $1,000 drone up in the air and a quick permit pull to be able to just go clear rooftops, which is what you would do looking for something out there. You don't need a sniper and Overwatch to be able to do this. You could literally have a guy with a quadcopter fly up and look around and make sure that you don't have that threat out to a reasonable distance. And so maybe, 300, 400 yards out. After that, if somebody is going to try to tap you from that far away, then you're really dealing with a real professional. But, this is like one of those things where hindsight's 2020. They also didn't have an ambulance on scene, Clayton. I noticed that they didn't have a staged ambulance, and that's very common. And it's sad to see that it's not there. I think you and I talked about that too.
Yeah, you and I talked about it offline a little bit, and it's crazy to me as I was looking at the Utah state, state statutes, and I know from friends who've put on large events in other areas. I mean, you absolutely, if you're in the city of Philadelphia, you must, if the crowd is more, I think exceeds like 100 people or something like that, it might be 200, that you must have a staged ambulance on site. You have to pay for that out of your pocket as a promoter. Yep. To make sure that an EMT is on site in case anyone's hurt. Even at local carnivals, you have to have. Now, I spoke to Carson Carpenter, who did a lot of these events with Charlie over the years, and he was struck by the layout of this particular, in sort of a horseshoe shaped pattern with these buildings, and said that they wouldn't really ever do events like that in this type of environment. And this one sort of stood out for him, both for its lack of ambulance, also the way that it was shaped, and it stood out as an anomaly for events that they've put on in the past, that this is not something they would have maybe approved or gone forward with at other events. So what do you make of maybe the horseshoe pattern in the buildings, the lack of ambulance, just coincidence?
I think that if somebody was looking for a great place to do this thing, then they found that thing. I mean, the upside, it's like an amphitheater setup. So if people haven't seen it from the sky, essentially you have a focal point in the middle, and it's almost like a baseball diamond, that there's some green in front of it. And then you've got kind of the outfield, but the outfield is terraced. So there's people that are going to be able to see further and further out. So you've got this sort of amphitheater sort of thing. Incidentally enough, I think that the thing that people used to do in the ancient world when they wanted to have their voice carry and project. So you have a very good way of getting more crowd in and have them see better. So we do it at concerts. But what it does
Right.
is it gives you a focal point where you know that your target is going to be. If someone's going to go hold an event in that space, I know exactly where they're going to be without having seen them set up, because it's very obvious that they're going to be at the center of the focal of that cone. And so that means from any building top that you're around in that sort of fan-shaped, you know, rooftop areas, like you're going to be able to look directly into what you want to see. So all you got to do is find a spot that doesn't have a tree, and they had a couple trees in the area too. You know, for a shooter, it's ideal. Does that mean
Perfect.
that you shouldn't have environments where you go and speak in an amphitheater? I hope not. I hope that doesn't what it mean. But you know, you can only see this in hindsight. You can only know that we really should have had an ambulance and doing emergency medicine. Now, at the end of the day, and look, I was a paramedic. I held a paramedic license for like 10 years, and I've treated gunshot wounds, and I've had people die in my hands. And I'll tell you from looking at it, just my first blush, we'll find out from the medical examiner later, but I don't think this was survivable immediately. The amount that even if they just
I
hit
think
the
once
neck,
you
I don't
know,
think you could survive it.
I think once you know that it wasn't everyone thought that he was shot in the neck, because that's what it looked to the untrained eye. But of course, you know better, and you could clearly see that he was hit in this soft body armor right in the middle of the chest. You see it move when the close-up videos you've shared with me, even closer than the ones that are shared on social media, which are just horrible to look at. But when you see it up close, you see that move. So I think initially people thought, oh, he was shot in the neck. That maybe would be survivable if they were able to get pressure on that quickly. But to the trained eye, looks like he was shot in the chest. Looks like the bullet may have traveled up through his spine, hit his spine, out his neck, right?
There's so many sensitive structures that you're dealing with when you start looking at this sort of like suprasternal notch, which is kind of like at the top of this breastbone that people are familiar with. You hit the breastbone, if it goes in there, you immediately have the top of your heart to deal with. You've got the aorta, you've got a couple other blood vessels that go out, like the I think they're called subclavicular arteries that run up, and then of course you have your carotids running up to your brain. There's a lot of blood, there's a lot of pressure that goes on. If you send a piece of metal bouncing through there, and it hits, then that's not to say anything about the central nervous system that's sitting behind it, right? You have your spine, which is protected by the vertebrae. So whether it interrupts that or whether it sends, a round out through some of these other blood vessels, it's so sensitive. I mean, it's the worst place in the world to get hit. It's, the only thing that's going to kill you faster is probably something like right in here where it's going to go directly into your brain. And we call it the T box between the eye and the nose running straight down, kind of a T in the middle of your face. Nobody, I don't know that you can survive it. I mean, if you were shot like that in the middle of a trauma surgery suite and they were able to scrub in and they were already ready for you, you still might not survive something like that. And from the way it looked on my end, and like I said, I'm waiting to see the rest of it. Kind of, it's just details at this point, so it doesn't actually add any value to our lives. But it looked really, really sad. It looked like, is that a professional shooter? No, that's someone who just aims center mass. That's the reason why you aim center mass. It's the reason why you see deer fall over, right when they hit them with a heart and lung shot. You aim for vitals and then they don't get up. So that's the reality of why a good shot works. It's the reality of why you aim for that place. It's the reason why every single person who's in law enforcement in the military, they aim for that spot because they don't want the threat to continue on. When we're talking about an innocent victim, it's horrific, but it doesn't change the ballistics or the, sort of the reason that the wounds are effective and where they're at.
I'll let you go here in a minute, Kyle, but what do you make of this suspect now? 22 years old, 4.0 GPA, scholarship. Have you ever seen anything like this? I mean, it seems to me out of the ordinary, but you're way more versed in this than I am.
I think that people get radicalized all the time, and I think it says a lot. First of all, he's 22 years old, so he's pretty impressionable. Sounds like he was raised by like a law enforcement father, so it's very common for anybody. Look, they had a term for people who are raised in strict households. When I was growing up in Texas, they call them PKs, preacher's kids, and those are like the wildest boys and the wildest girls that basically rebel against their parents the minute they get an ounce of freedom. So that happens. You also get people who have lived in a kind of vanilla household and upbringing, and maybe they were raised in a nominally Christian house, and maybe dad was involved in military or law enforcement, and you get that kid that just rebels and hates everything about it. So what do they end up doing? They jump onto an Antifa ideology. They jump into like hard leftism. They may find any number of other reasons. It used to be punk rock when I was a kid. That's what you did. You hated your dad, you did punk rock stuff. And so maybe you were involved in cutting a mohawk and spray painting, and doing graffiti. But there's always been a sense of like young people rebelling against whatever their family was. And I think oftentimes, given enough of a timeline, if they don't get themselves arrested or into a lot of trouble, they end up coming back and realizing like, yeah, I was a turd for a period of time, and then I became a grown up again. But that angsty, late adolescence and early adulthood time. I think that's real common. So it's going to be a real question of like what this guy comes up to and how he, how does he end up? How's he end up dealing with this? How did he end up getting there? And the Discord chat is going to be really a big piece of it. I think the friend and the roommate and like what kind of stuff he had going on in his room are going to be really relevant. So we're gonna see more about this. We're gonna have to ask, how does it end up fleshing out? But Ted Kaczynski is the example I think of. You talk about someone who's brilliant and capable and intellectual and a star in their field. Ted Kaczynski sat in a cabin and started sending bombs to people for like what 15 or 20 years. And similarly, right. He wasn't caught by the FBI. He was turned in by his brother, if memory serves. So there are stories that are analogs of this that are people that are very talented and otherwise seem like they have really promising things going on in their life. And they turn around and they do things that seem completely atrocious. But when you realize that there was some kind of a thing, something radicalized them, maybe they saw some stuff, maybe they slowly turned away from their upbringing and went down a different path. I mean, I did dumb things when I was in my 20s. I can say that they are very different than the way I live my life today. You probably have the same example or experience with the smirk that you got on your face. I think we can all look back and be like, yeah, there was a different guy that occupied this skin and was interested in different things. I mean, I went to a bunch of punk rock shows. I don't even like concerts anymore. So again, I have that same sort of instinct. I just didn't ever want to kill anybody. But I can see in a world where you're interested in video games and that violence is glorified in some ways, it doesn't mean the video game is the reason. It means if that's the alternative. There was I'll leave you with this thought too. There was a study that was done and released by Rutgers University in April of this year that said over 55% of the people that identify as left of center politically would be totally comfortable with an assassination of Donald Trump. And so they did an entire study and sort of a survey of people that are basically mainstream on the left, liberal and or, they identify with this leftist authoritarian ideology and that violence is acceptable. And so they called it assassination culture. It's something I covered this morning when I was reading on it. I went like, oh, and by the way, it was sent to me by an FBI agent who recognizes this being an ongoing threat. It just turns out our federal government has not addressed this problem in that same way. So I don't think they understand it yet. And I don't think I think that those of us who are looking at the culture see it, but the people that are in law enforcement that theoretically are going to prevent it, I don't think they could do that either. But I don't think there's a lot of prevention and there's certainly not a lot of like
over the past few
ideology there.
Over the past few years, we've been told that the greatest threat to the United States is white supremacists. It's Christians or Catholics who go to church, and or white supremacists. That's the greatest threat to the United States. But would you say that that's not the case?
I don't think it was the case then. I think that they were pushing a narrative, and that was some of the original whistleblower disclosures that I've had. Is that at the end of the day, you're allowed to be a white supremacist in America. Whether people like it or not is irrelevant. Like you have the constitutional right to be an a-hole. You can be as nasty and ugly and say as many horrible things as you like. It turns out you can think anything gross, whether it be on the far left or what people call the far right. And those are all protected and they're protected speech. What you can't do is do something about it. The problem is we've seen a media for probably about the last 10 years that have been aggressively pushing this sort of idea that silence is violence and speech is violence and those things are one-to-one, and that if you don't agree with me, this moral absolutism was actually cited in the study. The moral absolutism of the left says that if you don't agree with me, that you're actually sort of an existential threat to me, and therefore you're a Nazi or you're a fascist, and there's only one thing you should do with those people, and history tells us what to do. So they've actually sort of radicalized people, I think, in that way. So when you hear people like Donald Trump go out and say, the left has killed Charlie Kirk and that the ideology behind it, there's some research that actually substantiate that. And I think at the end of the day, we should be sympathetic to free speech concerns. And at the same time, you don't get off the hook. If you're advocating violence, then we probably have to have a more aggressive eye. And that's going to be a community level thing. Law enforcement can't do that because law enforcement doesn't know what this kid does in his room with his roommate. Parents do, and friends do. And we, if we're tolerating political assassination, or if we think that's acceptable within your circles, you're the problem. And I don't think I see it very many people on the right that say that. I think people say that they'll respond to violence like a lot of veterans would, a lot of, law enforcement folks that have retired would. But I don't see anybody advocating like this is the solution. And I certainly didn't see Charlie Kirk say that. He seemed like he was exactly the opposite. He said, if we stop talking, that's when we start shooting. So he didn't want that.
Well, it's just, it's been an absolute whirlwind. I appreciate your genius in all of this. your sober assessment of all of this and keeping us grounded, because so many people have wanted to run off and blame foreign state actors. And hey, maybe we'll learn that there is a connection there, but there's no evidence to suggest that. There's also no evidence to suggest he was a crazy trans activist either. A woman dressing up as a man or a man dressing up as a woman. There were people sharing images of the old man who was arrested saying, look, I think he's wearing a skirt. Must be a trans. It was an old man wearing white shorts. But that's how quickly people jump on these things, So thank you for
we all have to we have to fight our confirmation bias. And that's probably the biggest lesson that should come out, is that, we used to be able to recognize our own biases. And if you're just so quick to say that whatever happened is going to fit my narrative, and by the way, I don't need the facts, the absence of facts is good enough for me. This would be a good time to take a deep breath and realize that most things have a very simple explanation, as referenced by your own lives. When you see that something happened and your kid gives a fantastical story about how something got where it did, the odds are that didn't happen. It's like, nope, they took the bow and arrow out of the closet and they went and shot it through the window. It wasn't an alien spacecraft that used some sort of, propulsion device to pull it through the window. It's your kid who made a mistake. So a lot of times, that Occam's razor principle should come in. Today's probably a good day as any for us to retouch that.
100%. Kyle Seraphin, always great to see you. Please follow the Kyle Seraphin Show. Follow Kyle on X. Like, if you want a level-headed assessment of things, Kyle is your man, as always. Kyle, great to see you. Thank you so much for this.
Thanks, Clayton.